G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and this video is an animation tutorial on how to animate a bouncing ball. Now that sounds like the most basic thing you can do, which is why for many different animation courses or classes in high school or even in university, one of the first things often they get you to do in getting your hands used to using Flash and some of the features in Flash is to do a bouncing ball animation. Now I'm going to show you in 30 seconds to a minute how to pass that assignment without any trouble. Select this ball, hit F8 to convert it to a symbol, call it something clever like ball, hit enter, and there we go, we have a symbol called ball. Now that it's a graphic symbol, I have the ability to tween this object. To demonstrate this, I'm going to put this graphic symbol inside another symbol that I'm going to call ball bounce basic in camel case, hit enter, and double click to go inside it. Now I've got my own separate timeline simply for this ball bounce basic clip, where I can have a frame up the top here, and then let's say 50 frames across, I have a new frame by hitting F6, a duplicate of the same keyframe, and make it just touch the ground there, and then on frame 100 do the same thing, hit F6, and I can just go back up to the top. And if I want to make sure it goes back to exactly the same spot, I can copy my entire first keyframe by hitting Ctrl-Alt-C, going to the last keyframe by hitting Ctrl-Alt-V to make sure it's exactly in the same place, select both of these areas and hit create a classic tween. And this is apparently a passable bouncing ball. Now this tutorial isn't going to let this suffice, because for many of the classes that you'll do when they ask you to create a bouncing ball, that's enough for them. Just demonstrating that you know how to use a tween and move an object from one place to another and have it return and then have it loop, and then testing it by hitting Control-Enter and showing that the entire thing loops back and forth seamlessly. But for me, and most likely for you, this is not enough, because this is not an animation. This is not enjoyable to watch. It's quite disgusting. There are a few things wrong with it. There are a lot of things wrong with it. It's too slow. It has no motion. It has no gravity. It has no fun to it. It's just terrible. So I'm going to show you two different approaches to creating a bouncing ball animation that not only fills the requirement of demonstrating that you know how to make a ball bounce, but incorporates lots of other things like squash and stretch due to gravity and motion, easing in and easing out of a motion based on velocity, speeding up and slowing down throughout the bounce, and a lot of other things that make the entire bounce animation not only more realistic, but more enjoyable, more fun. So this is my terrible bounce ball, and I'm just going to put this over to the side here, quite embarrassed, and I'm going to copy and I'm going to paste, and I'm going to put the ball in the same place but just drag it across and make a duplicate. So I'll bring it into the middle just so we can see it clearer. Now I'm going to duplicate this movie clip by right clicking on it and hitting duplicate symbol, and I'm just going to rename this ball bounce better. And now when I enter this movie clip, I can make some alterations to the animation that I've already set up that doesn't actually affect my original one. So for example, one of the first things I want to do is make it a quicker bounce. So I'm going to bring this into 25 frames, maybe even 20. And then I'm going to drag this frame into frame 40. And then by holding Control, I'm going to hit the very edge of this very long frame and drag it in, just so that we have a shorter bounce. So you can see here that our loop is much shorter, and if I hit Control-Enter, we have two different ball bounces. One on the right, which is our original crappy slow bounce, and then one on the left or in the middle, which is our faster bounce. Now you can see with very little work done on it, it's already a lot better and a lot easier to watch, but it's nowhere near there yet. So with this ball bounce, I'm going to add two things that are going to make it look a lot nicer. The first thing is easing, and the second thing is squashing and stretching. When you have a motion in an object, when something moves from point A to point B, very rarely does it move at the same speed the entire time. Now I could pretend I'm a physicist and I know the equations as to why things speed up and slow down, but I don't. But what I do know is that they do speed up and slow down, even if very minutely. And with these tweens, what we actually have happening, if I show my onion skin here by clicking this and just showing all of the previous frames of this clip, you can see the spacing of every single frame within this keyframe is exactly the same. That means with every frame at this 30 frames per second, the motion is completely consistent, and that's just not in reality what would happen. What we know does happen, if we bounce a ball, it requires quite a lot of force to hit the ground, and then once it's hit the ground, it immediately ejects up at full force, but it slows down until it reaches the apex of its bounce, at which point it starts bringing its journey down and the velocity builds. So that's what we call easing. As the ball is going up, it's easing out of its full speed, so it begins faster and it eases out, it gets slower until we're at the apex, and then when it starts coming down, it's easing in to its velocity, it's getting faster, it's building momentum. So with these things in mind, I want to apply that to my ball here. We're beginning the bounce at the apex. So what I can do is, if I select a frame anywhere in the middle of this motion tween, I can go to my properties panel on the left here, and you can see I have a whole bunch of different settings that I can fiddle with, but I want to look at this one called ease under tweening. Now there are two ways you can edit the ease of a tween. There's this little scroller here where if you click and drag on that number, you can get a plus or negative number anywhere between 100 and -100, or you can hit this pencil, which creates a custom ease, and we're going to look at that later in the second bounce that we're going to do. But what I want to start off by doing is creating an ease, and I want it to ease into its bounce. So to do this, if we go -100, that means that it begins much slower, and then as it goes along, it picks up pace. Now, if I go to this last frame and show the onion skin again, this button here, you can actually visually see what this has done. The first several frames are much closer together, and the last several frames are actually quite far apart. So I'll hide that again, and I'll go to my second tween, and I'm going to ease the whole thing out 100. So our first one is an ease in by -100, and the second one is an ease out to +100. If I hit enter, you'll notice it slows down as it gets to the top. Now, if I hit Control Enter to test this whole thing, you can see already it's a huge difference. Just adding that ease, adding that sense of gravity, velocity building up as it comes down and then immediately slowing down after it gets thrown back up into the air, we get a much more physical sense, a much more real, tangible sense that something is happening. So we're adding this sense of gravity, we're adding this sense that this ball has some weight to it, but it still feels a little lifeless. It still feels like it's a nothing object. It's not made of anything. And so what we're going to do is we're going to squash it when it hits the ground and stretch it as soon as it goes up in the air, and you'll be surprised how quickly this adds a sense of tangibility to the object that we're animating. So to do this, I'm actually going to add a frame at frame 20 by hitting F5, and all this actually does is drag out the clip by one, but I'm just going to hit Control-Alt-C and hit Control-Alt-V and add that to frame 21, just so that we have exactly the same frame on frame 20 and frame 21. And then I'm going to do the same thing, hit F5 to extend it by one more, and then hit Control-Alt-V on frame 22. That way, frame 20, 21, and 22 are all exactly the same. This is going to make sense in a moment, because on frame 21, I'm actually going to free transform my ball. The shortcut for this is Q, and I'm going to squash it down by pulling it down vertically and a little bit wide horizontally. And that just means for that one frame, as soon as it hits the ground, it squashes like that. Now on frame 22, I want to immediately counteract that squash by stretching it. So I'm going to do the same thing, but in the reverse. I'm going to stretch it up and in a little horizontally, up vertically. And you'll see, if I just go back between these frames, we hit the ground, we squash, and then the ball is immediately stretching before it gets thrown up. And it actually is stretched all the way up until it eases out of its stretch through the tween. And this can be pretty cool, because essentially it shows that we're really getting this instant reaction out of the bounce. And if I hit Control-Enter, just to show this bounce in motion, already the ball feels so much more tangible. It really feels like it's made of something rubbery, because it's squashing and stretching. It's got momentum building up and then being taken away. And you can see the difference between this ball on the left and the ball on the right. It's pretty dramatic. and you could hand in the ball on the right if you're in a year 10 multimedia class. You could hand that in and pass. You could demonstrate that you know how to tween an object and pass. But a pass isn't good enough, especially for people who want to develop their sense of animation and be able to improve on their actual skills. And so the example on the left is really what we want to produce. We want to make something that feels a little more interesting. Now, speaking of a little more interesting, we're going to do one more ball bounce, but this one's going to be a little bit more intensive. We're going to have a ball bounce across in a few little arcs across the screen. So first I'm going to go out of this movie clip and I'm going to drag this just beside this ball here on the right, and I'm just going to leave that there. We can just forget about those for now. Now what I want to do is go to the left on my library. Now this can be in a different place depending on how you have your Flash file set up. By the way, I'm using Flash CS6. To access your library, if you hit Control L, it can pop up. Otherwise, I keep mine stashed immediately in view on the left dock. So I'm just going to drag in my clip, my graphic clip called ball, and I just want to make sure it starts at the same height as these balls, and you can kind of do that by, if you kind of drag it near them and just kind of go for around the same height, you get this line and it starts to sort of lock in place. So I use that to make sure it starts at the same height, but I'm going to drag the ball over here to the very left corner, and that is where my ball is going to start off. Now I'm going to create a movie clip of its own so that it can loop while I'm testing and we can see all of these things in context. So to do that, like we did at the very start, I'm going to hit F8 and I'm going to turn this into a movie clip. The reason I have all these ball bounce clips as movie clips is so that they can loop seamlessly without having any additional frames on the main timeline and without needing to all be on the same length so that they loop seamlessly when I test the actual Flash file by hitting Control Enter. So I'm going to call this one Ball Bounce Across. I'm so clever with my names. Hit Enter, and now I can enter this movie clip, and like before, I have an entirely new timeline that I can do whatever I want. So the goal for this ball bounce clip is to have it go down here and bounce maybe 3 arcs. Start off at the top of the highest arc, do 1 bounce and then 1 smaller bounce, and then kind of roll for the last little bit of it. Now there are a few ways that you can go about this. You can go about it the way we did with these balls by creating duplicate keyframes and just kind of moving the ball along those several points and then just adding a tween to all of it. But you'll actually find it will tend to move like this. So if I kind of create keyframes where the ball is at this point, then this point, then this point, it's going to move in a really square-like fashion, and that's not actually what we want to happen. The other way you can do it is to frame by frame, hit F6, move the ball, hit F6, move the ball, hit F6, move the ball, and this is a frame by frame animation where we can have that ball motion happening. The problem with that is if you need to go back and edit, or if the motion is even slightly inconsistent, it's really going to show and it's going to be difficult to go back and edit. So we're going to do something called motion paths. We're going to use guides to set up the trajectory, the path of the bounce, and then animate the ball along that. To do this, I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to wireframe and lock the ball for now because I'll come back to it later. It doesn't need to be used right now. I'm just going to get this tool here, which is the line tool, and I'm going to draw a line from the center of the ball to just above the ground, let's say about here. Now, if I hold Control while I have my line tool still selected, I have the ability to tweak the line. I actually can't do that unless I'm holding Control. So if I hold Control, I can pinch the middle of this line and create the arc that I want to use, and I can also refine that until I get the perfect sort of angle. The next thing I want to do is I want to continue the bounce along, but the problem is it all needs to be seamlessly connected on these lines. So what I mean is if I create the next line of the arc and just draw kind of from here to the top and want to create that bend, in reality, if I just kind of try and wing that, I actually might mess up the bottom area here. There might be a gap, or I might cross over the wrong way. So what I actually like to do is just draw a random line from, let's say, the top of that arc to anywhere near the other arc and just let it go. Let it go, can't draw a line anymore. And I want to hold Control and just click and drag this line into the other one, but I want it to snap directly onto the end of the other line. So to do this, you can see that while I have the line tool selected at the very bottom of the tools panel, there is this wee little magnet that says snap to objects. I click that just to make sure it snaps. Then I can click and drag with control held with my line tool on, hitting control, dragging, and then snap. We have the lines connecting, and that just helps me get an exact connection between the end of those lines. Now with control held, I'm just going to create that arc between this line here, and I'm going to do the same thing here with the rest of the arc. So I start off by drawing the line, then snapping it into a connection together like this, and then creating the arc. Same thing, so draw a line, then control drag until it snaps, and then I'm adding my final arc here. So next, I'm just going to bring my ball back because now we're ready to animate the ball. Now I want some more room to work with, so I'm going to go to frame 140 and just hit F5 and stretch both of these frames out. So I have my top frame, which is my line, and I have my bottom frame, which is my ball. And something quite important to remember is that using the motion path that we've created is only doable for as long as it's on the actual timeline, for as long as it's visible. So if we have this only go up to frame 50 and the ball's still there and the lines aren't, obviously we can't use those lines as a motion path. So we want to make sure that it's constantly visible. Now I'm going to create a guide layer. So I'm actually going to right click on layer 2, which is my lines, and I'm going to select guide. So you can see that the little paper thing has turned into a little pin thing. This isn't doing anything yet until I attach something to the guide. One thing it does do, of course, is actually make this line layer completely invisible once I'm rendering the clip. So if I hit Control Enter, you'll see that the line isn't showing when it's testing it, whereas if it isn't a guide, hit Control Enter, the lines are there. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So I'm going to turn it into a guide, and it's not doing anything until I drag this layer underneath the ball layer and connect it to the guide layer. And what this does, you can see I get this weird funky little line shape thing there. If I click it there, the pin turns into a ... arc with a ball on it. Isn't that interesting? Because that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So now I can animate this ball, and if I connect it at any point from keyframe to keyframe where both keyframes are at the pivot point connected to that guide layer, it's going to follow that guide. So I'm going to demonstrate what I mean here. I'm going to hit V and select the ball, and now I can move this ball around, of course, but I want to drag it so that it snaps to the very start, the very edge of that line. And then let's say at frame 30, I'm going to hit F6, and I'm just going to move this ball, and again, you can move it away, but we actually want it to connect to the line. So when I say connecting to the pivot point, you can see that when you select V or Q, there's this little pivot point, there's this little dot, and you can actually move the dot, you can move the pivot point around, but I actually want this line to connect directly with that point in the middle. So I'm just going to go to the very bottom of our clip here, and you can see that it doesn't quite touch the ground, so I'm actually going to edit my line by dragging it down a little bit and then grab my ball and drag it to the bottom. So now the ball is touching the ground and the pivot in the center of the ball is connected to this line. If I right click and hit create classic tween between these two keyframes, not only does it move from point A to point B, but it moves following along that line. This is a really useful little tool. So we've got our first motion moving down to there. Then I'm going to create a new keyframe after that, and I'm going to separate it from our line here, and I'm just going to bounce it on the ground. I'm going to add that squash like we talked about before. Doesn't matter that it's disconnected because I'm not using any tweens or anything, but on the next frame, I'm going to hit F7 and just copy and paste my entire ball from before. And I'm going to start it a little later in our line. And I'm going to do the same thing. And let's say around frame 65, I'm going to have the ball go here at the bottom of this line as well and hit create classic tween, and you can see that we're following that arc still. Now the ball bounce is a little lifeless in the sense that there's no rotation at all, and in reality it should be turning with the motion. So what I'm actually going to do is go back to the first frame. Now you need to make sure that Q, your shortcut for quick transform, is selected, otherwise it's this button up here on the tools panel. I'm just rotating it back. And now you can see that we're getting a bit of a motion as it moves forward. I can actually rotate it a little bit more so that gets a bit more of a dramatic movement. Then we get our bounce, and then in the next frame in, I'm gonna make sure it rotates along a bit, and then by frame 65, I want it to have rotated quite a bit. So we're making sure to follow this motion. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the end of this bounce as we had on our previous bounce, and that is to create another keyframe here where we squash the ball and then create a new keyframe on the next frame and paste our original ball and rotate it very slightly. Make sure we begin a little further along this line, and then let's say on frame 90, have this come around, rotate it a bit, go to the end of this line, make sure that we're touching that motion path, and add a classic tween and make sure that, there we go. So we've got our bounce following along. So if we go from the start, we have the rotation moving along with it, the ball's bouncing, and then when we hit the end here, we actually don't need this motion path anymore. So I'm going to hit F7 on frame 91, and then on frame 91, I'm going to create a new keyframe, just rotate the ball a little bit, move it along, and then I'm going to create a motion tween from this frame on frame 91 to, let's say, frame 120, where I'm just going to drag the ball across, rotate it, and create a classic tween between these areas. Now, if I hit enter from the start and we can watch this entire motion progress, we've got a pretty cool looking ball bounce there, but we're missing one important thing, and that is using eases. Now for this first motion tween, this is pretty easy. We begin at the top of that apex and it's building up velocity as it's dropping. So we want this to ease in. So I'm going to click and drag on my ease panel, and we can see that we have the ease in. What do we do here? Where we have at the start of this tween, we have it where it should be easing out, and then the last half of this tween, it should be easing in. In theory, what you can do is create a keyframe in the middle, and then on the first tween you can ease out, and then on the second tween you can ease in, and you can play between those and you get sort of the motion you're looking for. But what I want to show you can do now is create a custom ease, and these are really cool. They're a little confusing to wrap your head around at first, but once you get used to them, they're incredibly useful, and I use them all the time. Eases in general should be used quite often in any situation you feel it should be applied, and I will tell you from my own personal experience, and I do a lot of client work, I do a lot of animation, I use eases and custom eases in about 90% of my tweens. It's very, very rare that I don't ease a tween, whether at the start or the end or in the middle or anything like that. I usually use an ease. So I'm going to select anywhere in the middle of this entire long clip here where it's going up and down. I'm going to hit this little pencil where you can see you get the option that says edit easing. If I tap that, I get this funny looking line graph thing. If you select any of these little boxes, there's one on the bottom left and one on the top right. If I select this, you notice that there's actually a little pivot thing that I can select and move around. Now, moving it up like this means that it's easing out. It means that the motion is starting off faster and then slowing down. If I pull it down, it means that it's easing in, which means that it starts off slower and builds velocity. So what I actually want to do is move these around so that we get a shape that looks something like this. So I've got my first pivot pulled up to around this area and my second pivot pulled down to around this area. And this creates the first half of the motion is an ease out and the second half of the motion is an ease in. And that means that if I go to later along in this ball animation and show my onion skin and drag it for the duration, you can see how this is working. For the first part of this ease, we're getting a quick motion, and then as these balls get closer together, it's lengthening the motion out, so it's slowed down at the precipice of the arc trajectory. I really hope that that phrase made sense because I think it makes me sound really smart. And then as you can see here, they're getting further apart, so it's building up momentum. So if I play this all together, we get that sort of look. Now it's a little extreme, but that's okay because I can go into my pencil tool and break it down a bit. I'll soften the ease just by softening that line, hit OK, and now if I hit enter, it's a much nicer bounce. And I'm going to do a similar thing with this third arc here, and I'm going to hit the pencil tool and I'm just going to pull that line graph into the sort of shape I want. And then the very last thing I want to do is I want this very last tween of the ball rolling and the last portion of it to just ease out. So I don't need a custom tweeze, I'm just going to drag it to 100. Now the moment of truth. I'm going to hit Control Enter and bounce, bounce, roll. Ooh, almost. It's a little jittery at the end there. I feel like it just kind of out of nowhere gets a little too solid. I think that's maybe because it goes straight from a bounce into the roll. That's okay. I might have to have, in the end, added a tiny little mini last bounce, but that's okay. For now, we've demonstrated our point, and I hope that you can kind of appreciate the value of adding these eases and adding these squashes and stretches to make something a little more realistic and a little more entertaining to watch. So you can see from our first initial bounce here on the right, tween from point A to point B, that compared to our more dynamic bounce next to it and our motion pathed dynamic bounce on the far left, there is no competition. Obviously, these bounces on the left kick the butt of the bounce on the right. That's the end of this video tutorial. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to check out the link in the description that goes to the tutorial reference file for this file. So if you actually want to check out the individual bounces and look at the eases and how all that has been put together, you can check that out and download the reference file, or make sure to save it down to CS3. So if you have Flash CS3 or above, you can check that out and get your hands dirty and have a look at how I did that. Thanks for joining me, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I'll see you later.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel to see new content every week. Check out more of my stuff by clicking the annotations over there. You can get the reference files for this tutorial by clicking the link in the description, and if you want the reference files for all the tutorials I've ever made, check out the tutorial archive. If you're looking for a great place to collaborate, explore, or share your own content, head over to newgrounds.com. That's it for now, and until next time, see you later.